All right. Thanks again to everyone for joining our webinar today. I am Drew Williams, the marketing manager at Kobiton, and today's webinar is entitled Healthcare QA, Unique Demands and Challenges. We're joined by some great panelists today. First of which is Freddie Vega, who is the manager of quality and test practice at Wolters Kluwer. Additionally, we have Adam Satterfield, who is the director of testing and quality at Anthem. Also joined by Scott Aziz, who is the former leader of software quality Center of Excellence at Imprivata. And lastly, this entire panel is being moderated by Paul Grzaffi, the principal automation architect at Magenic. And before we get started, I'll just briefly go over some of the rules. So each panelist will have exactly 2 minutes to answer each question, and all audience questions will be answered at the end. Lastly, for the audience, just so that you're keyed in here, each panelist will have an opportunity to both present opening and closing statements throughout the panel discussion here. So with that, we will get started, and I'll turn it over to Paul for the first question.
All right, thanks a lot, Drew. So with healthcare, and obviously we've all spent a little time working in healthcare, the industry is constantly reacting to regulatory changes for state, local governments, insurance regulations, especially if you're working on some of the back-end activities. But how does this factor into your strategic QA initiatives? And we'll start this one off with Freddie.
Hi guys, thank you for that. Thank you, Paul, for the question. From our perspective, we always take people, process, technology, tools approach. Specifically, what I mean is that within the software development lifecycle, it helps. At least it has helped in our context to shift the discussion around testing from are we done testing yet, which is more of a task-based view of testing, to more of a does the thing that we're delivering right now possess an acceptable level of risk, which is more focused on and implies risk identification and mitigation, which is what the things that we focus on when we're doing regulatory testing. Now obviously this means that you'll have to take a risk-based approach to your testing. But this, at least from our point of view, it hasn't been a big leap because as testers, we already do this intuitively to inform which way our testing should go as we explore. The need here is really to operationalize the approach. To that end, we can create organizational test processes, which we have, that can guide the development teams and everyone else in the organization as they implement their own sub-processes. As an example, ISO 29119, which is the software testing standard, while this standard does not deal specifically with medical devices or software, it is a general purpose testing standard that can be used as a guideline and leveraged to create all the organizational test processes, which we call building blocks, that will be utilized as templates, if you will, by the rest of the organization. What has helped me in the past and currently, as we implement these organizational test processes, is creating a custom for your own organization maturity model that encapsulates all of the goals of the organization in terms of delivering and developing quality products, and involves not only the software development lifecycle, but it's a key, the product development lifecycle as well. Then we have teams do a self-assessment that gives them an idea of how aligned they are or not to the organizational goals for quality deliverables, and then we track to that. Our approach is to build all these building blocks, if you will, so that from the get-go, we are being proactive in our approach to testing. In other words, quality engineering, as opposed to only being reactive, like quality assurance. The main takeaway here is that you should structure your test process so that it can scale as well as grow with the organization as their needs change, which they will, as regulations change, for example, or business needs change. And from my perspective, the way to do that is to build a modular process framework supported by tools.
Okay, great. Thank you, Freddie. So Adam, over to you. Same question. How does this factor in? How do the regulatory changes factor into your strategic QA initiatives?
Sure, awesome. Yeah, hey everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So really two items from my side. The first, Freddie touched on is a risk-based approach. So, within healthcare, defects are expensive. Not only do we have the time where the developers have to fix something in production, the testers have to test it. So not only do we have a staff overhead cost, but many times in many areas, things such as, working, especially if you're working with Medicaid or Medicare, you get fines from the government for, insufficiently delivering the agreed upon software. So you must always factor in that risk-based approach. What are the high business value, functions, paths or flows that must always work to ensure that we're delivering a high level of quality to our end customers? So that's really the first thing. So really anything we do, no matter if you're a waterfall team, agile team, safe, hybrid, whatever, it's really following that risk-based approach. It's absolutely critical. And then the next piece is ensuring that you have, as we call, flexible minds. You have to be a little bit flexible because especially when dealing with some of the regulations. So if we think back to some of the Healthcare Act that happened a couple of years ago, there were a lot of very rapid changes that were coming, and a lot of times they were coming from the government very late. So you had to be flexible and really have an ability to work with those teams to understand how to make those changes happen relatively rapidly. So from a testing standpoint, not being rigid and really being stuck to your test plan and having maybe an overall test strategy that is more of a guideline that will help you understand the various things, whether it's claims testing or whatever it might be. So don't get stuck into the way that it should be and really try to focus on what is the best thing we can do to ensure that we're having a high level of quality delivered to our customers.
All right, great. Thank you, Adam. Over to you, Scott. Same question.
Yeah, hi everybody. Appreciate the opportunity today. So yeah, it's definitely a large consideration. There's no question about it. When you're trying to lay out an overall quality strategy, there are a lot of things that you need to think about. But in most cases where regulations apply, so I found in terms of best practices, the team really needs to follow a process that they can demonstrate that they've proven a particular documented process has been followed, right? So in other words, there's got to be some sort of audit trail based on the specific regulatory requirement vis-a-vis testing that you're going after. And so, and while I mean, honestly, many people just consider this good software engineering practices. It definitely still requires a great deal of planning. There are a lot of things, as I mentioned, that you really have to pay attention to. Things like having auditable records, things that include, could include things like reports, validating the engineering processes that you're following, that the team is following, and making sure that there are quality gates, et cetera, around all of that. And of course, having documents and artifacts that show that yes, indeed, we actually followed this particular process, from end to end. So I I think in general, the key here is actually just following good engineering practices, as was suggested earlier, and I think paying attention to good engineering, good mature QA processes. Is also really critically important. So I think that when you consider, one of the most important pieces of specifically of compliance, it actually boils down to the development and implementation of, as I mentioned, written quality standards, right? Written quality standards of conduct, written policies, written procedures that basically describe those specific rules that you're trying to satisfy around compliance and that the team needs to focus on. So you've got to share all of that stuff. And then really once you have that, you're well on your way to getting everybody on the same page with, practices like internal monitoring and audits and all of that other stuff that you do to actually measure compliance. So, I think the bottom line is quality is a marathon, right? And it's not a sprint. And, the investment to maintain a compliant state needs to be communicated clearly to management and then shared on a roadmap with the whole team.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. We're going to go on to the next question now. There are a lot of players in the healthcare system as a whole, lots of providers and consumers, your general providers such as your doctors, your PAs, your nurse practitioners, nurses, intermediaries, regulators, solution vendors, the patients themselves, that we might even consider clients or customers. How do you consider everyone's requirements and everyone's needs with each release? And with this question, we'll start with Adam.
Sure. Yeah. So this one's a tricky one because a lot of times you are up against a time limit. So one of the things that we do with our testers, and I mentioned this a little bit ago, is understand what are your critical business paths, or as we also call them, your high business value path. So in that, you say these are the things that must always work for every single release. So it's probably going to be something like claims payment, or billing, sending out ID cards, whatever it might be. So within that, you identify your personas or actors, depending on the terminology you like to use, and you say these are the things how these actors will actually work within the high business value path. So from there, you start to identify the folks that must be validated or must be worked with or must be taken into consideration for every release. So from my side, it may not always be everyone. We may have a release where we're only changing something really on the member side, and we don't necessarily need to take into account every downstream system, but we may take into account the various things that are being changed and the actors that are being affected by that change. So, again, I know I did mention risk-based testing before, but, really with a combination of risk-based testing, which a lot of times will allow you to understand the business flow for what you're actually testing, which I think is really the most important part here. What I'm saying is, as a tester, understand whether you use HBV, whether you use RBT, or either one of those, but truly understand the business flow and the business value for what you're trying to test, and don't get stuck into looking at just the technical changes and technical requirements. I think that's the easiest way to be able to understand the various, providers, members, hospitals, whatever it might be that you're working with. So I think that's it.
Great, thanks, Adam. So Scott, over to you. Same question. How do you consider everyone in your ecosystem's requirements with each release?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So for me, my experience has been, I found that good PMO organizations actually help facilitate that. And, it's a blessing if you have a really strong PMO organization that can support, that is aware of that and actually can support you. Also having strong product owners and project managers that basically have shared vision on the entire set of users that we're delivering for, right? So what is the universe that we need to deliver for with this particular release or series of releases? And so because you have so many different influencers, one of the things that I find is the requirements can sometimes be in conflict, right? So really a critical aspect of managing the requirements and the requirements process in general is actually making trade-offs with those requirements. And I don't think a lot of people think of it this way, but I do, in that really what this is it's a negotiation among the team, and having at least a few people across the team that have very strong negotiation skills can really help help make these trade-offs and really help get shared vision around what we need to focus on, again, across all of the stakeholders. So, I think for me, that's probably the most important thing, especially in terms of team dynamics. But of course, ultimately, we still have to provide value by, minimizing project failures that could be caused by poor requirements, an incomplete set of requirements, etc., and potentially requirements that could be, as I mentioned, potentially in conflict with one another. So we've got to pay, obviously, a lot of attention to that. And I think the bottom line is that it's really, it's a team effort. The team has got to find ways to work together and to potentially either reduce scope or refine the list of requirements to try to satisfy all the stakeholders. And again, I think really strong negotiation skills are key to that. Now, of course, the last thing I wanted to mention here was, while this, might be a little bit pie in the sky, and I recognize that it, doesn't always happen this way in reality, in the real world. Some stakeholders aren't, when they don't get what they want, there are problems, but that doesn't mean we can't strive for it. So I think that's the ultimate goal.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. So finally, Freddie, what about you and your teams and your organizations? How do you consider everyone's requirements with each release?
Yeah, that's actually, there are a lot of players, and the first thing that you do is you identify the players, right? Who are your customers? Especially when you have a complex system, like for example, in our case, we have a web application, we have mobile application, both native and web. We have creative content, we have a content platform, and we have microservices, just to name a few of the piece of the pie. Now, on top of that, add the fact that everyone is agile nowadays, and you can see how things can get chaotic relatively quickly, especially around releases. There's no silver bullet from my perspective, because release cadences are going to be different for everyone. So everybody's needs are going to be different depending on the context. But now, no matter what the release cadence is, however, in terms of testing, our strategy always involves verification and validation tests as they pertain to each one of the players that we've identified. So what we do is first, we verify deeply that we built the thing that we're building correctly, by checking against, if it's a web application, check it against the CSS spec, if there's any sort of conformance to any relevant standards or guidelines that we need to follow, HL7 protocol, HIPAA, CFR, whatever it is, we verify those as well. And then we validate broadly that we built the right thing. And this is where we employ all the different players, if you will, or the customers that we have. So, our approach is verification and validation. And on release time, we one of the a practice that we follow, which we have found that helps, even when you have fully automated releases, is to name a release chief. And this release chief is the one that has a checklist of all the things that are going out, and he is aware of all the players and is responsible for communicating the release status. That's about
it. Great. Great, thank you. Okay, so we will move on to the next question now. Sensitive data, and again, I did spend a stint of time in healthcare as well, and this was something we found challenging. It is not only just handling the sensitive data in general from a security standpoint, but handling testing when either sensitive data is involved or when we needed to have data that sufficiently resembled what was in production so that we could perform our testing. So we'll start with Scott on this one. Scott, how do you and your teams handle this?
Yeah, so this is actually really, really important. You've got to be diligent to obviously comply with any regulatory standards for handling the data, but you also can't tie your data up in knots because of that, right? So you still need access to a good set of data to satisfy your test cases, to ensure full coverage, to ensure proper coverage. But the good thing here is that there are a lot of tools to really help with this on the market. I mean, whether, many of them freeware, et cetera, but, and of course, a lot of organizations just write their own to help. But, tools that help with things like data obfuscation, data masking, basically just putting in practice, scrubbing data to do, and making sure you're removing PII, right? So I think that's obviously one very critical piece of it. I find on the management side, though, you've got to be really clear with the team and putting in place and publishing procedures for how to handle sensitive data, right? That's really important. You got to be able to give visibility to the team so that everybody's marching in the same direction. And often it even makes sense to have a data tools expert. This is something I've done as part of the QA team, right? So you actually have somebody dedicated to employing tools, coming up with potentially common scripts that can be shared, common processes within the tools that can be shared across the team to take some of the burden away from the actual QA team. And then on the implementation side, as I already mentioned, obfuscation or masking solutions to hide confidential data. If you're actually using production data, if you actually are compelled to use production data, but also consider not using real data at all, right? And using tools that synthetically generate data. That's been a great option for teams that I've been a part of. And again, there are tools for synthetic data generation that can automate this task for you and make it really, really simple. To be able to put that in place. So, yeah, those are some of the things that I've employed.
Okay, Freddie, some items from you around handling sensitive data.
Yeah, thanks. So, like Scott said, all right, so, from our perspective, we see this in two different ways. We can either go fish for data, right, and scrub it from our live systems, or we can build data sets. Which one you choose depends on the context. With any approach, though, it's important to keep in mind, the principle of garbage in, garbage out. Imagine running a test, banking on your test data being correct, and then unbeknownst to you, a reshare of the data happens, and now all your tests are failing. This is where having a sound test data management policy in place is actually makes sense. So a test data management policy includes things like how often to refresh the data, what data is refreshed, what data is scrubbed, whether we use tools to build the data like Scott alluded to. All these things are covered in the test data management. Now, which approach you choose to follow, like everything else we do, like I said, depends on the context. For example, if I'm doing validation tests, I may want scrub data. But if I'm doing, the validation tests are the ones that actually are dealing with the real users of the system. So in that case, I may want to get real data from production and use that. But for verification tests, when I'm verifying deeply the features that I'm working on, I may want handcrafted data because I want to be able to, implement test case design techniques that allow me to invoke certain scenarios that may not be possible with real life data. So similarly, a partnership is definitely needed in order to ensure that the data being used is scrubbed correctly and can pass muster if the need ever arises. But this will be covered in the test data management policy. And similarly to that, the scrub data, if we're using scrub data, has to be technically sound for the functionality being tested. For example, if you scrub too much, you might miss some interesting bugs. This should also be covered in the test data management policy. And finally, if you're using cloud providers as a platform to execute your tests, ensure that they can provide secure access to your systems and their systems. Those are some of the items that we follow when we're testing with sensitive data.
Okay, and then Adam, finally over to you for your thoughts on testing with sensitive data.
Sure, thanks. So one of the first things we always have to keep in mind when working with sensitive data is time. Oftentimes, it takes a lot of time to run the PHI data or sensitive data through the scrubbers or the de-identifiers to give us a good data set that we can use. And then from there, it actually takes more time to populate that through the systems because it's not just a simple set of data. For instance, if you're working on a website, maybe you just need a user to log in for. But typically with healthcare, we need members tied to providers, tied to claims. So it's a much more complex data set, and that data set must match. And it even gets a little bit more complicated if you've got multiple teams testing on top of one another, to where the data may wind up getting corrupted, and you have to go back and request new data. So as one thing I always encourage all my testers is, as you're going through the testing process and the test strategy, plan out your test data first as early as possible, because you know that it's going to take a lot of time to identify this test data. And this is very, very important when after you do a production release and go into your warranty period, because if a defect comes up, you're going to need data very quickly. So go ahead and request that data and start anticipating some of the things that might come up, so that way you've got a good data set that you can pull from. Second is tools. So it was mentioned before, talking about that there are good tools on the market. So, outside of the tools on the market, one of the main things you'll have to make sure is that you've got good rules in place to ensure that teams are not putting PHI data inside of your Jira instance, inside of your test management solution. because those are things that other people may have visibility to. And if you've got PHI data in there, the auditors will definitely hammer you for that. So you want to make sure that you have good, governance. I know Freddie mentioned this here a minute ago. Definitely agree with that. You have to make sure you've got good governance. One of the things I've seen teams do is you can essentially create a script that runs in the background that goes and looks in the database of your test management solution or Jira itself and looks for PHI data. It essentially does a regex check for all sorts of social security type numbers and things like that, and gives you the audit or the governance team a report, and then they can go and work with those teams just to make sure that the data that is going in is not PHI data. So, and again, that also adds a bit of time. So really thinking about it, time is really your overall limiting and massive factor, but you also want to make sure that you've got some good governance rules to ensure that teams are following the right procedures.
All right, great answers. On to the next slide. So Agile, DevOps, topics that are still hot and will probably be hot in our industry for quite some time. But are there specific things we can do to leverage Agile and DevOps to make the greatest impact in QA for healthcare? Scott, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, so for me, this comes back to figuring out ways to just make the test engineering process more efficient and more effective, right? And particularly within the concept of Agile and DevOps, where you don't need to adopt every single best practice, but you've got to fit within your organization, within your team, within your environment, the practices that you believe are going to help you the most. Just in general, because we have to deal with more process and compliance matters in the case of healthcare regulations, it just makes sense to embrace the best Agile and DevOps practices that allow us to gain the most efficiency. So it's something that obviously is something that really is critical. So when I think about that and actually applying that, it includes things like continuous testing in conjunction with the continuous integration process, right? So doing things like putting in place a just-in-time test automation process immediately after a build, right? Immediately appended onto the end of a build. And, basically putting that process in play, build after build after build. Could be daily, could be hourly, could be, whatever it is within your organization. But, just in general, for example, I generally like to put in place a smoke test to execute within a 15-minute window, right? And basically what that does is what you do is you just put your critical workflows in there to act as a build acceptance test, and then you close that down within 15 minutes and give yourself a decent opportunity to identify any blockers, or certainly any serious blockers that you would have with a particular build. Again, just one small best practice within the realm of DevOps to put that in place. But so just finally, if you look closely at the 12 principles in the Agile Manifesto, many of them align perfectly with highly regulated behaviors, right? And when you think about the behaviors that teams need to pay attention to, particularly in a regulated environment like healthcare, things like satisfying customers through early and continuous delivery. That's right in the Agile Manifesto. Things like continually seeking excellence. That's right in the Agile Manifesto. I think there are a lot of examples like that where, again, picking and choosing some of the best principles, applying those to the best DevOps practices can really help, an organization. Whether you're regulated or not, they can help. So, yeah.
All right, great, thank you. So Freddie, over to you. Leveraging Agile and DevOps, is that something that you're finding can help specifically or help in a unique way with healthcare?
Actually, yes. From our perspective, I think Scott alluded to this. He mentioned continuous testing. To begin with, I would say automate, and automate. Continuous testing, or I should say, continuous production of information that can be actioned on by automated systems in order to make informed decisions on whether to go to the next step or not. Okay, those are a must-have in order to be able to keep up with DevOps hunger for speed, which is also known as continuous delivery and continuous deployment. Now, having said that, and contrary to popular belief, what Agile and DevOps bring to the table is a lot of documentation in the form of artifacts that are produced by the numerous automated tasks and tools and systems that are involved in the process. I'm talking about tools like Jenkins, Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket. There's a lot of documentation out there that is being generated as software gets from a developer's computer onto a source control system, into a build system, and then into a deployment system. All this information is captured by the systems. So that's a huge plus for DevOps as well. The flexibility, it gives you also the flexibility to mine and organize the artifacts in a way that can effectively show compliance to acceptable risk factors that have been identified before by the product development teams. So finally, this information that on the risk factors that we've identified, we can use this information to define and create automated quality gates within the build and delivery pipelines that take the quantitative or the qualitative inputs from the prior steps to make an automated decision whether to stop or go forward.
Sure, absolutely. So yes, this certainly can improve the overall quality of delivery to our customers, and that's really the main thing that we really care about. The big reason why I think DevOps and Agile can help is because it encourages communication and breaking down of the walls. I love this. I think it's great to where if we think about the older days, the days gone by, where if we're in waterfall, we've got a business analyst or some sort of product person writing requirements. A couple months later, they hand that over to the dev team. The dev team, reads over the requirements. They implement what they think the requirements are supposed to be, and that's handed over to the testing team, and then they write test cases and test what they think the requirements are supposed to be. And the actual communication was very limited amongst those. And then if you had to engage with the infrastructure team, that was a whole nother, lengthy path. So now with Agile and DevOps, we're bringing a lot of these teams together, and they're having communication up front. They're talking about the risks and the impediments during the sprint planning or backlog refinement session. So we're not waiting until the end of the process to have these conversations. We're actually doing it in the beginning. One of the cautionary tales I will put in here, though, is we have seen a lot of large companies, healthcare companies included, when they bring teams over from waterfall to Agile, is there seems to be a gap in training testers and developers, for that matter, with the necessary soft skills to lead those conversations. Because, it does require a different level of understanding of how to gather information and how to communicate effectively inside of a sprint planning or backlog refinement session to identify the risk and talk about, the implementation and potential gaps. So for you all out there who are looking to implement Agile or DevOps, or if you're in the middle of it, I highly encourage you to ensure that your testers are comfortable leading those conversations, because if they're not, essentially what you're going to wind up with is mini waterfall sessions. You'll wind up with essentially a 2-week waterfall session where the teams really aren't talking to one another, and you're back to the same reason that you were trying to fix when you move over to Agile and DevOps in the first place.
All right, great. So going on to question 5 now. What are some of the common pitfalls when using test automation in healthcare, and how do you avoid them? I guess I would say, I think we probably are all very familiar with some of the general pitfalls. Are there specific ones around healthcare that we might put our foot into more often than not? Freddie, we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah. So, from my perspective, what I've seen in I've worked in healthcare and I've worked in other industries as well. What I see as the most common pitfall in test automation in any industry is doing it for the wrong reasons. That's as an example, let's say espresso. Folks might be familiar with espresso, which is is an automation facility from Google for Android apps. Now, we might say, let's automate with espresso. Why? Well, because it's the latest trend from Google. That's why. Or because they say that if the test code rents an apartment next to the application code, magical things happen. Not really. The approach, this approach is optimized and will most likely only work if your application developers are actually the same ones working on the test code. So, that might be a wrong reason to go down that path. Another reason, another lesson that I've learned is investing a huge amount of time in generating automated tests. Automated tests are not only volatile to constant change, but they should be viewed as such. Investing too much time in a test case you may not need in a year or two may seem like a good idea from the onset, but 2 years down the road, it may not be that good. So having said that, there has to be a balance, and this balance would be different depending on your specific context. Now, another common pitfall is coding the test cases. Test cases should be consumer friendly and readable by humans. There are, even when they're automated under the hood, they should be read by humans. This gives you more players in the test case creation arena. Otherwise, you'll be depending on technical folks to create test cases all the time. Test cases should not be coded. And finally, if you can, I would shy away from custom frameworks and instead build a tool agnostic and common testing platform that can be leveraged by all of the teams. This can encourage reusability of all the components that you're building out and also reduce the cost in the long term. Check out as two examples of this, open source frameworks, Robot Framework and Redwood HQ. There's two examples of that. You'll thank me later. Code maintenance, especially code that is written by non-developers, can be messy and will more than likely be hard to maintain. Avoid this problem altogether, like I mentioned earlier, by not coding your tests.
Okay, thank you, Freddie. Adam, over to you. Avoiding common pitfalls of test automation, particularly if there's some that apply directly to healthcare.
Absolutely. Yeah, so really two main points here. The first is data. I know we talked about data a minute ago, but especially in healthcare, as I was mentioning, data itself is relatively complex because you do need, member associations to providers to claims to ensure that we're accurately testing, what we need to test. So you can have the best test automation script in the entire world, and it may only run in a matter of seconds, but if it takes you days to acquire the data for that test, then are we really getting a big value? So you want to make sure that you include a solid test data strategy when building your automation framework to make sure that they're compatible and you get the most efficacy out of both of those. So that was the first one. The second one that we typically see is healthcare, going back to being a regulatory type of industry, is we find that oftentimes teams get very myopic and looking at their test automation strategy, and they only think about functional test automation in terms of what is the test automation that we need to be creating for the testing team themselves, the teams that are actually validating the functionality. When in all reality, they should be thinking about what is the full picture that we need to consider to ensure that we're getting adequate coverage. And that's essentially going to be coming from all the way starting with unit testing. And I consider unit testing a very strong portion of test automation and something that's very critical. And then all the way flowing down to that functional test automation, and then with performance and security testing. I do see, a trend with a lot of companies as teams move to Agile and DevOps. Oftentimes, that good, strong performance and security testing is still left to the last minute. And there's a lot of wonderful tools on the market that give us the capabilities to run our performance and security tests up front, almost at the same time that we're running some of our functional test automation. So again, the 2 points is ensure that you've got a good test data strategy. And then second is ensure that you're taking into account, the full breadth of test automation and not just functional test automation.
Thanks, Adam. And then Scott, over to you finally for the last thoughts on automation and pitfalls and QA for healthcare.
Yeah. So I think because of the regulatory needs, the adherence to regulations, and just the general demand for delivering the highest possible quality wrapped around a product, your automation must be bulletproof, right? And that's really my takeaway here, because you've really got to be sure that you've got solid processes in general around automation, right? This includes things like, of course, design reviews, architectural reviews, having peer reviews, and maybe even doing peer testing, etc., as well as demoing your scripts. But you've got to do all of that. You've got to sort of institutionalize that and really make that part of your definition of done, and make sure that your teams understand that there's a reason why we're trying to strive for this level of quality. Never mind the regulations. We're trying to deliver something that, as I mentioned earlier, is bulletproof. And that's sort of the term that I like to use with teams. If those, in general, if those practices aren't followed, automated scripts can't or really shouldn't get introduced into your test environment, right? And this just becomes another series of quality gates that you would use to control the testing process. And as each testing asset is readied around automation, you basically have a quality gate for it. You introduce it, you make sure it's tested. Again, you go back to your definition of done, and then it just becomes another layer, within your overall strategy. And then I think, finally, the other thing that you've got to worry about is design, right? Automation design. You've got to make sure that, for example, you've got enough or a complementary automation-based testing approach. So, for example, that could mean 50% API, 50% UI. It could mean 25% API, 75% UI, and vice versa. It's going to change. It's going to depend on your product and what you're trying to solve for. But basically, just balance out your automation strategy with other types of other approaches to testing, and just attack automation from multiple angles. And that's generally the best practice that I follow.
Thanks for that, everyone. And now we'll get on to the final prepared question before we get to user or audience questions. And we'll start with Adam this time. Adam, how can teams outside of healthcare apply some of the same principles and some of the same sort of healthcare specific items that we talked about today?
Yeah, sure. I think it really starts with two things. The first is the risk-based testing. I see this as a very underutilized skill in the testing industry, and something that can really provide a lot of value. In my 20 some odd years of doing testing, in pretty much every type of company I've worked at, the QA team has always been up against the timeline. And the question always comes up, well, what should I test first? What should I validate first? And risk-based testing, the approach that it gives you, can really help you identify what are the high value things that we need to validate. So that's the first one. And then the second one is those high business value tests, or thinking like the business. I'm a big fan of behavior-driven development. I don't think it's necessarily a panacea in the testing world, but I do believe that it provides skills and capabilities to a tester to understand the reason behind why are we doing this. Outside of the technical change, what is the reason we're trying to do this, and what is the customer expecting? So ensuring that you've got the appropriate view into the business and the reasons why you're doing your testing, instead of just looking at the technical aspects, are absolutely critical. So I think that, combined with the risk-based testing, will make you an all-around much better tester, and you can essentially apply that to any company or any testing team, no matter the industry.
Scott, over to you, sir. Applying to healthcare sort of specific principles of QA outside of the healthcare industry. What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, so I think for teams external to healthcare that don't typically apply, or might not apply the same level of rigor, they should really just take an iterative approach, right? I think I mentioned this in one of the earlier answers, but just take an iterative approach in terms of learning some of the test engineering and quality practices that would be used in a regulated environment, for example. And then I'm a big believer in just enough process, right? So you got to be careful to temper that, and just take care not to over-engineer the testing process, right? Just for the sake of process alone, right? So, but instead, just focus on knowing and understanding where your current quality gaps are, and I think once you understand that, you can be selective with applying only the methods that make sense for your team, right? Based on your current maturity level, based on the maturity of your team, and your existing processes. But it's this to me really isn't unlike TMMI or CMMI models, right? Where you have organizations that pass through different levels of maturity, and then for example, at the top of the maturity curve, you have things like, defect prevention practices, right? And those things take a lot of investment, they take a lot of preparation and organizational buy-in, right? Not just with the QA team, but all across engineering. And so you don't want to take something like that on, right? You don't want to jump into something like that right away if your team isn't ready to make that investment. So just bottom line, basically, don't try to take on too much at once, but instead just find the sweet spot that allows you to, and your team, to incrementally improve quality.
Outstanding. So that concludes the, oh, no, I'm sorry, it does not. Freddie still needs a chance to answer. So Freddie, applying the principles outside of the healthcare industry.
Okay, I think you forgot about me there, Paul. Okay, yeah, I'm just going to echo what Scott and Adam have said. If I had to pick a couple of items, I would say the risk-based testing approach is something that most likely all folks are doing now intuitively, like I mentioned earlier. It's just a matter of operationalizing that and making it, making an informed decision to do it, and then capturing the artifacts that come out of that, the risk-based analysis that's part of that doing the testing. Now, the other thing that will be important is that I would say that teams outside of healthcare in any industry can apply is having a common testing platform. Having a common testing platform where you could build tests on top of is actually, what we've seen here at Wolters Kluwer, where we are distributed amongst different locations, and everyone is using the similar testing platform, and all the pieces that are being built for the validation of UI, for microservices or what have you, they're all centralized, and everybody has access to them. So that's another way that you can, another win that you could quickly get from something that we do in healthcare, because we want that repeatability and that consistency. So getting to a repeatable and consistent state, I think, is a valid aspirational goal for all quality engineering teams, and that's what we should focus on.
All right. Well, thank you for all those great answers. For our prepared questions, Drew, I will turn it over to you to handle the questions for the participants that are listening in today.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to Adam, Scott, and Freddie for fantastic insights there. Hopefully, we will continue those with some of these questions we have from the audience here. So number one, when negotiating requirements with regards to considering everyone, what exercises do you recommend for getting all stakeholders on the same page? Anyone who'd like to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, so
Adam
here.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott. Thanks. Yeah, appreciate it. So one of the things we like to do is ensure that we have, the various, actors or personas, identified and written down, because one of the things that you don't want is death by committee, to where every single person tries to put something in, and essentially you wind up with a document that's got a lot of bloat. So you want to make sure that you truly understand the functionality that is going in, and those who are going to be impacted by that functionality, and those who are going to be, it's almost like, for those that are familiar with a RACI chart, you have the understanding of who is actually being directly impacted versus those who just need to be notified. So you can use a RACI chart as a good example, or you can essentially just understand, maybe even through a SWOT analysis, understand who is impacted, understand the actual changes going into the release or the project, and then start there.
Awesome. Did anyone else want to add any thoughts there? Cool. Freddie, this one looks to be aimed at you. When electing a release chief, what qualities do you look for?
That's a good question. So the release chief is a floating role, and it should be a person that has reach and has established relationships, across the different teams. So it has to be a person that's active within the different Scrum teams. Normally, we choose a development manager, or perhaps a product owner sometimes acts as the release chief, but mainly it's a person that has to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, and they have to be able to think quickly, because there is a rule book that we play by, and they have to be able to assess the situation quickly, and then come up with a resolution, because in our case, for example, that our releases are automated, but we do have quality gates in there. So, basically, there has to be a person that has reach for the current release that's happening, all the pieces, all the moving pieces that are part of the release. That this person has to be aware of all these pieces and at least have some working knowledge of them.
Awesome. Okay. How do we handle issues which arise as a part of miscommunication or lack of communication between business and development? When a testing team catches such issues, generally there are disagreements between business and development on whether that should be considered an issue at all.
So
I'll take a stab. Oh, go ahead.
You first this time. I went last time.
Okay, good. So this is where if we're talking about finding bugs, right? This is where from my perspective, from my point of view, when a bug is found by a tester, that tester is responsible for assessing the severity of that bug. Severity to us means the impact of that issue to the system that I'm currently testing. So the only person really that's capable of making that assessment at the time that the bug happened is the person that's finding the bug. So we assign a severity to the bug at that time as we're putting in the information for the bug. Then down the line, we could decide how to prioritize that bug and when it's going to be fixed. But as far as the severity and the impact to the system, there shouldn't be any question to that, because the person that actually found the bug is the one that did the initial assessment and captured all the pertinent information to substantiate the severity that was picked.
Awesome. Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that Freddie, from my side is, when having a conversation, especially a conversation around defects, there can tend to be relatively high emotions because, it could put the project at risk. There can be various factors in trying to fix it in terms of having to go back and do a major re-architecture. So one of the biggest things I guide my testers is, to take some of the emotion out of the conversation, to really just try to stick to the facts of, this is the functionality that I validated. Here is, the result of that, which is this defect, which is going to cause this impact. And then at that point, the tester then can then help facilitate the conversation of, hey, if the business is okay going out to production with that known impact, well, ultimately, it is essentially their decision. So as a tester, we document, we inform, and we ensure that we're working together as partners. But you want to make sure that you try to drive the emotion out of it as much as possible and try to focus just on the facts. And that can help to relieve some of the tensions with those conversations.
Fantastic. We've got a couple more questions here, and I know we're getting tight on time. So let's try to keep the answers a bit brief on these next two. How do you handle issues as a tester when your testing data comes from other systems, which is being handled by a completely different team, so you do not have dedicated resources to create your data?
That one is not an easy, quick answer. Really, part of it is you're going to have to, all right, so one of the things I would suggest, as a quick answer is to essentially try to work to create a data community of practice where the various teams from the various organizations can all get together to come up with an agreement, essentially a pact of, hey, this is the type of data we're usually going to request, and this is the format we would expect it in. So that way you kind of start that conversation. Otherwise, it's a much longer answer of really trying to dig in and find what the root causes are. But that's off the cuff what I would suggest.
Yeah, and just to add to that, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think that you've got to just make the team, and maybe at this point this is more of a leadership team thing, but you've got to make them aware that data is absolutely critical to testing success, and that if you don't have the resources to help craft it or help mine it or whatever you need to do in order to get data into your system or into your area, you're putting the whole testing project and vis-a-vis the whole project at risk, right? So to me, some of this goes back to, okay, I don't have enough resources to craft my data and or help mine it. However, we need to adjust the project plan, or we need to talk about what other trade-offs we can make, because data is just so central to quality. Having good data is just so central. So I think, to me, I think that's what would be how I would address that.
Great. Okay. Last question likely here. what do you think is a good ratio for developers to QA? Currently in our team, there are 7 developers to every 1 QA, which is the person asking the question. We have both mobile, native, and web, and I feel this is quite a lot on my plate.
Well, it depends on the quality of testing that the developers are doing themselves. So if they have a very robust set of unit and integration tests and they're handling the vast majority of the technical testing through their own automated testing, and you as the tester are really having to make sure that you're validating maybe an end-to-end or some of the more complex solutions, then that possibly could work. Unfortunately, there really is no magic ratio, but it all depends on the level of quality that your developers are putting out.
Yeah, and I'll add to that also. What helps is the testing approach. So by using a risk-based test approach, you can also minimize the number of test cases and focus your testing on the things that matter rather than the things that don't matter. So I agree with Adam. Well, there's no magic number. There are things that we can do to make sure that we, even if we're only have I member mentioned that is 7 developers and one QA, you can still have, by using a risk-based approach, you can have it could still be sustained. That's been our experience, because we have a low ratio just like that as well.
Great. And I think we have time for just one more right before we run out of time. So quality is everyone's business. Therefore, a lot of companies are now eliminating the testing roles. Then who really is responsible for the testing? Developers don't have the time. What are your thoughts on the importance of the QE?
Well, so from my perspective, we're currently, quality engineering to me is about being proactive, and preventing bugs before they happen. And while quality assurance is more about being reactive. So the shift is in quality engineering and avoiding bugs before they happen. Is actually, while it takes a little more effort up front to do, that in the long term it comes out a lot cheaper, because you get to market faster, because you're focusing on reporting using a risk-based approach. You're focusing on reporting on the residual risk. So your reports actually become more manageable and easier to consume from the stakeholders.
Awesome. Well, unless anyone else has anything to add to that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this webinar today. Again, thank you to Paul, Adam, Freddie, and Scott all for joining us. And as well, thank you to the audience for joining this webinar. If anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to send them to marketing@kobiton.com. I'll be happy to seed these questions through the guys who are on the panel today and hopefully get you some responses. In the interim, look out for the recording of this webinar to be available on the Kobiton YouTube channel sometime either next week on Tuesday or Wednesday. So with that, have a great one. Thanks, everybody.